Hello everyone and welcome to the latest Work Foundation event looking at the changing state of the UK labour market, where today we're going to be looking at the implications of the latest labour market data and today's new inflation data ahead of the autumn statement next week. My name is John Fitzmaurice and I'm the Head of Engagement here at the Work Foundation, a policy think tank which is part of Lancaster University. We're committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid, secure employment, and our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural inequalities within the labour market and the interrelationship between health and work. Just to say that we're recording the conversation this morning, and if through the event you want to ask a question to one of our panellists, please do so using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I'll be keeping a track of that as we get into the wider discussion and can raise those points with our speakers. We've focused a lot in 2023 on the challenges in the UK labour market, falling real wages, economic inactivity and worker shortages among them. But over the recent weeks, question marks have appeared around the labour force survey, specifically regarding falling survey sizes and the extent to which this could be providing inaccurate data. The Office for National Statistics is now transitioning to a new transformed LFS, which will be launched next spring. But in the meantime, we're now working with a reduced and experimental set of data, and the prospect that what we know or think we might know about the UK labour market in this post-pandemic period may not actually be the full picture. So it's important to bear those factors in mind before we do go through the data release this week. It's also important that policymakers and politicians are equally conscious of these issues. Some decisions can't be delayed, whether that is on interest rates or raising the living wage or welfare benefit levels. But broadly, we would encourage policymakers to proceed with caution and base any policy changes on the longer-term structural trends we see in the labour market, such as high levels of insecure work, rather than the figures I'm going to present alone. To help us discuss and make sense of all of this, I'm delighted that we're going to be hearing from a fantastic panel of contributors today. Professor Hilary Ingham of Lancaster University, Martin McTague, National Chair of the Federation of Small Business and a Low Pay Commissioner, and Jane Van Zyl, Chief Executive of Working Families. Before we hear initial reflections from our panel, I want to set up the scene on the latest data. So if we can pull up the slides, please. So the UK unemployment rate decreased by 0.1 percentage points to 75.7%. This was down from a record high earlier this year. Unemployment is largely unchanged at 4.2%. This is still historically low, but we lack details on the impacts of certain groups, particularly young people, that as unemployment goes up, sometimes are more affected. Annual growth in regular pay, which excludes bonuses, was at 7.7%. This is slightly down on previous periods, but is still among the highest annual growth rates since comparable records began in 2001. Vacancies have been falling from their record highs, and they fell for the 16th consecutive period, and they're just below a million at the moment. Economic activity was largely unchanged on the quarter at 20.9%, which is still high. But again, because of the issues with the ONS's data, we don't have figures on long-term sickness, which was at a record high of 2.58 million when it was last reported in September. And on to the next slide. This morning, we got the headline news around the consumer price index inflation, and that rose by 4.6% in the 12 months to October 2023. This was down sharply from the data released last month, which was 6.7. This is driven by a slight decline in energy prices compared with the steep rise this time last year. While this is also important is that last month's figures are traditionally used for the uprating of benefits announced in the autumn statement next week. So there's a question mark over whether there's been such a difference, whether the government might alter that practice. And food inflation is still high at 10.1%. This is more likely to impact those on low and middle incomes, but will hit those in insecure and low paid work hardest. So to get us going with the conversation, I'd now like to bring in Hilary Ingham, Professor of Economics at Lancaster University, to provide her perspective on the latest data and the labour market and economic picture as a whole.
Hello, thank you, John. I think the statistics that have come out over the past couple of days are quite interesting. The labour market ones really weren't very spectacular at all. Unemployment's 4.2%. It's still low. But as John said, within those figures, there are going to be pockets where it is quite high. And in particular, young people are frequently the worst group affected. And again, in terms of inactivity, it is good that we have the figures, but we really need to know what is going on with this long-term sickness, because these figures are astronomical and the government is keen to get these people back into work. I think it's fair to say for most commentators, the inflation figures that came out today were more important. They were widely predicted that the figure is actually very much in line with forecasts, but inflation is now 4.6%. Of course, prices are still going up, but the rate at which they're going up has slowed. Now, I think for the government, the really important thing of this is that they have achieved one of their pledges. So one of the things that Rishi Sunak said he would do is halve inflation. So in the last quarter of the previous year, it was at 10.7%. So he has actually managed that. And I think this will be very much a headline figure for him, because, of course, very soon this morning, he's going to get a ruling on Rwanda, which is very likely not to go the government's way. Now, if you actually look at that figure, and if you look at where the falls are coming from, it's very much driven by energy prices. So in a sense, it's not really happened because of anything the government have actually done. It's happened because of exogenous forces. So the government, in a sense, has been very fortunate there, because the energy price cap, which is the amount that an average household will be charged, has fallen from 2,500 to just over 1,900. So really the government has been a bit fortuitous in what is happening here. If you look at other bits of the equation that make up this figure, you know, food price inflation is still 10.1%. That is high. So although here we have got good news for the government, it's not everywhere. There are pockets where prices are still rising quite sharply. But I think the good news is for everybody really that it looks like that this figure is going to mean there is not going to be increased pressure on the Bank of England to go with an interest rate rise at their next meeting. And it looks as though interest rates will be held steady. And going forwards, I think we're probably looking at more of the same. So that's my take on the figures that have come out over the last 2 days.
Thank you very much, Hilary. We'll certainly dive deeper into some of those issues you've outlined as we progress this morning. And again, if you do have any questions for our speakers, please do add them to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. For now, I'd like to bring in Martin McTague from the Federation of Small Business for his reflections. Martin.
Thanks, John. Well, for small businesses, it's been a pretty tough year. There have been significantly higher costs for most of them, in particular energy. But when you look at the pressure on wages, a lot of that's coming through food inflation. And you can see that although the rate of inflation is slowing, it's clear that if you're buying food, it's 30% more expensive than it was a couple of years ago. And for most working families, that's the most important thing. The labour market, well, the LFS figures or the problems with LFS make it very difficult to come to any firm conclusions about what's going on. But one thing's for sure, there are clear signs in our surveys that access to skilled workers is particularly tough for small businesses. they know that they're going to be outbid in terms of salaries by their bigger brethren, and that makes it extremely difficult to compete for the important part of the labour market. The other thing that I think a lot of people forget is that to create a secure working environment for people, you have to have a secure business. And one of the things that has deteriorated quite significantly over the last year are payment practices by the bigger companies to their supply chains. They've deteriorated. That means in some cases, business owners are having to resort to funding their businesses from personal finance, or even not taking anything at all out of their businesses as a way of trying to keep the wolf from the door. And of course, the political volatility that we've seen repeating over and over again over the last few years still is a major factor in most small business owners' decision making. That wasn't the case a few years ago, but now is playing a much bigger role in their decision making over the next few years. So I'll go back to you, John, at that point.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Martin, and we'll come to some of those points as we get going. And now I'd like to bring in Jane from Working Families to offer her reflections. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you, John. I'm going to be focusing on working families, as you can imagine. We did some research in 2022, our Working Families Index, and at that point we found that 6 in 10 of working parents had said it was becoming more difficult to make ends meet. So in this year, 2023, we did a deep dive with 2,000 working parents who were earning less than 50,000 and asked them what they were experiencing. Obviously, with families paying 30% more for food, and that is probably the largest percentage along with rent of their income, that's going to have a significantly poor effect on them. So we wanted to build this picture to understand what was happening to working families. And we found a number of things. Those with low incomes clearly bear the brunt of the rise in energy and food prices, and of course, rocketing childcare costs. Parents on lower incomes are much more likely to be denied flexible working. They are forced to forego promotion, reduce their hours, leave work altogether to look after loved ones. And this exacerbates their already challenging financial situation. Our free legal advice line has seen a significant spike in the number of calls from parents and carers needing advice on in-work benefits. And 40% of people receiving universal credit are actually in work. Childcare is a burning issue for parents. 2/3 of low-income parents with children under 5 said that finding the money for childcare has put families under pressure. And even more concerning is that 4 in 10 low-income parents said they'd gone into debt to pay for childcare. 3 in 10 working parents also tell us that it's had a negative effect on their relationship with their partner. And we have examples from people telling us that they're paid £9.50 an hour, but childcare locally is £11 an hour. Now, that doesn't square. 40% of families on low incomes are relying on grandparents to manage informal childcare. But according to the EHRC, grandparents who take on caring responsibilities can be pushed into their own economic hardship. And of course, if you add intersectionality into these issues, it becomes even worse for these families. So for us, we don't think there's enough funding to realise the promise of a fully supported system from 9 months to 4 years old, as the Chancellor spoke about in the spring budget. We also think that there should be a much better focus on single parents, families on lower incomes, and parents and carers in insecure work. And a lot of that insecure work is found by lower income parents. And certainly our work with small businesses are not terrible employers. They really do want to, one, keep their businesses afloat so they continue to employ people. But also there is a lack of guidance, and we're delighted that government is going to be doing something about that in the first quarter of next year, ahead of the new flexible working regulations. There is also the issue for us that working parents, and particularly working mothers, in the UK, working mothers take on average 9 months worth of maternity leave. But for parents on lower incomes, that drops to between 4.5 and 5 months. And that just simply isn't necessarily enough for mothers to recover from birth. So, yeah, we also believe that government should increase the living wage and should review statutory rates. So that's our view of where we are right now for working families on lower incomes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jane. And if you'd now all like to turn on your cameras, I think a really interesting set of reflections. And I'd like to start off, if I may, with Hilary. Obviously, we've looked at the headline data, particularly on inflation. People will be thinking that, you know, prices that maybe are coming down, as you say. But do you think, you know, when is the cost of living crisis going to be over, I suppose, is my question. When are people going to start feeling like it isn't so challenging? Sorry, Hilary, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. One thing you can take away from the figures we've been talking about this morning is, with wages going up at 7.7% and inflation at 4.6%, it actually means that real wages, i.e. purchasing power that people have, has actually increased. And that is the first time that has happened for a very, very long time. But of course, that isn't going to impact across all sectors of society. So while certain groups have seen inflation busting pay increases, that is not true for all workers. So the big, you know, ones we see on the television, those groups have done well. But I'm sure Jane will say that a lot of people she talks to, you know, with working families on lower incomes, they're rooted to the minimum wage and they're not getting very big increases. So those people are not feeling better off. At the minute, I mean, the conflict in Ukraine goes on. You know, there still is an energy crisis. The government, you know, is going to give North Sea permits, which doesn't, you know, please the green lobby. So we don't quite know what's going to happen. I don't see energy prices falling significantly anytime soon. So personally, I think this cost of living crisis is going to continue. I can't really see any end to it for, say, another 12 months. It seems very unlikely to me.
Thank you. And I suppose can I just quickly follow up with Hilary on one point, which is, we're obviously seeing wages in the majority of sectors above inflation at the moment. Do we expect that to continue into 2024?
I don't expect it to continue. And the other thing, which is a point I'm sure Martin is going to pick up on, that the headline figures you see, these are big employers, things like the National Health Service. Whereas lots of small businesses, they simply cannot afford those sort of pay increases. So I think the sorts of things that appear in the media are actually misleading. I think they give people the wrong impression of the conditions that a lot of people are working under. So a lot of people are not getting wage increases of 7.7%. You know, large employers, Google, Amazon, they can afford this, but most employers cannot.
And Martin, to bring you in, I suppose, knowing that is the picture, how are small businesses attempting to deal with their recruitment and retention challenges in the labour market if they are always being outbidded by, you know, their bigger competitors, as Hilary says?
Yeah, I mean, big businesses do compete on wages, but you've got to remember that as far as small businesses are concerned, they compete on flexibility. They're generally a lot more flexible. They tend to be purpose-led businesses that people feel a sense of pride belonging to. They also get a lot more autonomy when they work in a small business, you know, than they do with major employers. And I think that generally gives a greater sense of satisfaction. But when it comes to the employer, the owner of the business, and they're faced with increasing headline costs of wages, what is tending to happen, especially in the low-paid sectors, is they're squeezing other elements of the employment package. So where there were bonuses, where there were various allowances that were helping, that kind of flexibility is getting squeezed down. You're seeing a lot more part-time workers, because if you split a job into two, and you've got two part-time workers, then the NIC bill starts to fall. So you know that for many of these businesses that can't pass on the cost of labour to their customers simply won't stand it. They are forced to do a lot of these things. When it comes to the big employers, they've got the resources to try and weather this storm. They will try and sit it out in the hope that they can hang on to their market share and recover at a later date. That option isn't available to a lot of small businesses. They have to find a way of funding this in the short term, and that is very difficult. The average small business, 40% of them operate on 3 months worth of cash, no more. So it is hand to mouth. And for them, it means these decisions are crucial on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you for that. And I suppose, Jane, bringing you in, knowing that sort of hand to mouth, obviously certain working families are really struggling. And I know you talk about, the government's plan for childcare, which I think we'll get onto definitely when looking at the autumn statement next week. But do you see other countries or other places providing better support for working families to sort of weather the cost of living crisis that we're continuing to see?
Well, for us, what's important is what's happening within the UK. And one of the things that we would like to see is more support for people on lower incomes than currently exists, and certainly an uplift in benefits. A proper review of whether or not it is affordable. Because for us to have 40% of people on universal credit in work says that there is a problem somewhere in the system. And of course, that then also leads into issues with pension contributions and what is a looming crisis with women receiving 1/5 on average, having 1/5 the pension pot of the average working man. And that's a societal problem. That's not just a problem for lower income workers. That's a problem for us in the future. So for us, there's that issue around childcare, and I know you said we'll get onto that, but also then looking at the percentages of income that lower income parents spend on rent, food, and heating. That's taking up the bulk of all of their income. And as Martin said, with food costs at 30% more than they were a few years ago, and as Hilary said, those lower income families' incomes not getting increases, it becomes a real problem. We did some research about 25 years ago, which I know is a very long time ago, looking at micro businesses, those employing less than 10 people. And we found that there, the kind of flexibility and support that employees were getting from employers was really good, because the employee understood the needs of the business and the employer understood the needs of their workers. So there was a much more positive and supportive, flexible arrangement. But the other thing to say, I think, for us in terms of families is that there are many working parents in insecure work who's simply not getting the hours they need in order to earn enough money to meet their costs. And you have to work part-time if you have children under 5, because you can't leave them at home alone. Or, well, not safely anyway.
Yeah, and we did a piece of research recently called Limited Choices, which looked at the lack of choices that those people in insecure work face, which are often around childcare, often around things like transport and the shifts they could work, and that actually they didn't have a choice other than to take jobs that were insecure to fit around their schedules. And I suppose just moving us slightly on, I've had a question here from Harry Thompson, and this one probably is for you, Hilary. While average wage rises are above inflation, we're obviously seeing that there are certain sectors where that's not happening. Where is that sort of concentrated? What sectors are we not seeing those sort of above inflation pay rises?
I mean, I think in a lot of manufacturing enterprises, there doesn't seem to be much going on. They're not going up very quickly there. I think catering, they were rising quite quickly. I think that's falling back. So I think many sectors, education, for example, a lot of education institutes are not having wage increases in that line. So that there are quite a lot of places where it isn't. It's the big ones that you see, like what's gone on with teachers, what's gone on with nurses. Because the other thing, even when they're getting these big pay increases, you sometimes see they're getting a payment as well, so a one-off. So that's sort of exacerbating the problem. So it is really the things like the NHS, which of course employ many, it's a huge employer. And these very big employers, they skew the data in some ways because they are what is driving these increases.
Yeah, and could I bring in Martin and Jane to sort of your reflections there on the sectors that are struggling and the people in them, but also the organisations in those sectors?
I mean, the sectors that are struggling the most are not a big surprise. They're retail, hospitality and leisure. But what's happening is the bulk of the wages in those sectors are being driven by minimum wage legislation. And what happens then is further up the pay scale, employers start to squeeze the differentials. So I think you're seeing people who are working as supervisors and middle managers in some of those sectors are not getting the pay increases that the others are getting. The other factor I think to take into account, and I think it was something I think mentioned earlier, is that if you're on benefits, then any increase you get in the living wage or the minimum wage, roughly 60% of it is clawed back through your benefit payments. So really, the government can afford to be quite generous when it comes to awarding increases in the minimum wage because it effectively cuts their benefits bill. And I think also the point Jane made about the distorting effect of bonuses in the public sector, I think that has created quite a false image or impression of the rate of wage increases. But LFS is all over the place right now, so coming to any kind of firm conclusions about settlements and the labour market is very difficult.
Thank you, Martin. And Jane, would you like to come in?
Yes, very briefly. The High Pay Centre recently released figures which said that the CEOs of FTSE 100s had received a 16% salary increase, an average of about $500,000 each. So I know that's a tiny percentage, and I'm not in any way suggesting those people don't work incredibly hard. But as Martin said, it's the people right at the bottom end who really are struggling. And the percentage of income that they give out to real basics is the stuff that is going to be problematic. And, for small businesses, having really worried, really stressed employees is not good for them either. It's certainly not going to help their productivity. So for us, it's always going to be, we would want a focus on lower income families.
Thank you. And Martin, just because we're sort of skirting around the issue a little bit about the labour force survey and the data that we're getting, you're obviously a low pay commissioner, so I imagine the Low Pay Commission rely on that data like everyone else, and you are providing as a group advice to the government on what the levels of national minimum wage and national living wage could be. How tricky has that been? Has that impacted the processes that you've been going through? We've obviously seen the Bank of England now aren't quoting that data in the same way. They're using other estimates. How is that impacting decision making?
Well, I don't know how many people know the process, but essentially it's a bit like electing a pope. We are locked in a country hotel for 3 days to negotiate this rate. And the rate is discussed in a tripartite arrangement with academics, people representing employees, and people like me representing employers. It was an incredibly difficult and stressful negotiation this year because clearly there are massive pressures on working families, as Jane has said, and you want to try and relieve some of that pressure. But at the same time, I don't think you're doing anybody any favors if you crush the bulk of small firms that are. I mean, when you think of the private sector workforce, something like 60% of that workforce works in small businesses. So, if you're going to not take into account the impact it could have on those businesses, and therefore the impact on roughly 16 million people working for them, it's a big mistake. So it was a very tricky negotiation, made much more difficult because we didn't have reliable data and there was a very volatile situation. We clearly don't know where the Ukraine war is going to go, the impact of the Middle East on the economy. So trying to come to a conclusion and recommend a rate that's going to apply in April next year, it's going to be extremely difficult to try and make that work. Now, I know what we've recommended, and I think they'd probably shoot me if I told anybody what we've recommended, but it will be significant. And I think that's been flagged several times. It'll be a significant increase.
I was hoping you were going to give us an exclusive there, Martin. But I like your professionalism and keeping it to yourself. But that's really interesting. I suppose a question, I'm just keep with you for the moment, Martin. A question that we've had from someone who remains anonymous. Are smaller employers potentially not replacing staff because they can't compete on wages and the labour market at the moment?
Yeah, I think what's happening is small employers, when faced with increasing labour costs, are making some really tough decisions. So that they may decide to scale back their business. They may decide if they're operating a business where they can reduce the number of shifts they work, or they can reduce the number of rooms they've got in a hotel, say, they'll do that kind of thing. And there's really strange implications. If you take like inactivity, where you've got this very high number of people on long-term sick, that at the moment, small businesses used to get rebated for statutory sick pay. They don't anymore. Now, that means it's a very difficult decision to take on somebody that could have a whole series of long-term sickness problems. And that, therefore, exacerbates the situation. So, you've got much higher levels of inactivity because of that, because small business owners won't run the risk of employing somebody that could be subject to long-term sickness.
And I think you weave us very nicely on, I suppose, the big missing for the labour market stats this week is long-term sickness. So we know it's at record levels. And I suppose I'd just be interested, Hilary, for some of your reflections on where you think, depending on how it's being measured, where that's going, and, what potentially the government could be looking to do in the autumn statement. We obviously the last budget was seen as a back-to-work budget. Rumours are this will be another back-to-work budget. And then, Jane, just the impacts, I suppose, of long-term sickness on the people that you represent at working families. But Hilary first.
Right. I mean, obviously this inactivity has gone up very high, and we have got this long-term sickness. And if you look into those figures a bit more, I know we don't have reliable data at the minute, but what it did show was a lot of that long-term sickness was mental health issues. So I think there's two things here. I mean, we can't rule out the pandemic. I mean, it has got lingering effects. So, younger people, people couldn't go to school, young people couldn't go out and socialize, and we don't know what effect that has had on their mental well-being. they didn't have normal interactions with people that we all had growing up. And then, of course, the other thing to remember is the NHS waiting lists. So you've also got people, physically sick. There might be awaiting, say, a hip operation, so they're not mobile, they can't get to work. So all of the things that the government has to make decisions on, in a sense, they're all interrelated. Yes, it wants to get people back to work. In terms of the NHS, mental health provision is not generous. It's quite difficult to actually get an appointment, particularly for younger people. That's very stretched, those services, because demand has shot through the roof. And then you've also got people who need an intervention, a surgical intervention. And without that, they can't do their job. And so I don't think until these problems are solved, I think until the NHS manages to clear this backlog, a lot of this is going to be solved.
There's certainly a lot for the autumn statement to tackle next week. But Jane, just coming in there for sort of working parents and working families.
Yeah, I echo everything that Hilary said. There's all kinds of different intersectional issues that happen within families. And for us, one of our big things is people having access to flexible work. And by flexible work, we are not talking about just remote working or hybrid working, but access to shifts, and certainly people with caring responsibilities, which might include self-care, only working enough so that you can maintain your health and keep going back to work. And then, as Martin said, for small businesses, taking somebody on who's going to be off sick becomes a real problem, because you just can't afford to take that risk. And that means that it's limiting the pool of people that you might be able to employ. But we don't know what those numbers really look like, and we don't really know why those people are reporting as being long-term sick. So until we've got better data, it's supposition.
Definitely. And I suppose we're talking a lot about the autumn statement. It's the thing that we're all looking at next week. Hilary, is there, the big, I suppose, debate, depending on what area of the press you look at, is there any fiscal headroom? Is there any space for different spending commitments than have already been made? Until before we get into the conversation on autumn statement, it'd be useful just to get an understanding of where you think that sits at the moment.
Right. So one of the things that has come out over the past few weeks is this headroom that the Chancellor supposedly has. So the Office for Budget Responsibility, they guide the Chancellor insofar as they provide the underlying data as to where they think the government's finances are. And over last week, they've come out that it might be in excess of 15 billion. So he might have more money, if you like, to play with than he originally thought. Now, some commentators have actually said that this is actually an illusion, because the money has only arisen because wages have been increasing, and so has the tax take. So that's where this money has come from. So what is he going to do with it? It's a big issue. Is there going to be very much for the labour market? I mean, he is still committed to bringing down inflation. Okay, they've halved it, but he can't afford to put in place any measures that are going to reverse that decline. So that is going to be his major focus. I mean, he wants to get investment going, he wants to get people back to work, and he wants to reform public services. I'm not totally certain how he wants to reform them, but that's what he wants to do. So he does want to get people back to work. And I mean, another thing that I was thinking about, I mean, I don't know if he's going to do it, you did allude to it earlier, is of course there's this intergenerational inequality in a sense, because people on state pensions are likely to enjoy an increase, which is going to be much higher than young people on minimum wage jobs. So there is a debate about whether he might break that triple lock. Now, that would be very dangerous for him insofar as they must hold an election next year, and traditionally older voters will tend to vote Conservative. So they could be alienating a lot of their core supporters. But I think that there's an awful lot about, inequality with all this employment and wage issues. So, there are people that are doing very well. They're getting wage increases. They've got jobs that do offer them flexibility of the sort Jane was talking about. I mean, we think of flexibility as working from home, but it's far more than that. So it can be the number of hours you do, how many weeks in a month you work. So there's all sorts of things. And I think it's really some of those more granular issues that the government should be focusing on and seeing what it might actually cost to reduce some of these inequalities. I mean, we don't know the true figures, but youth unemployment rates can hit, alarming figures. And then there's an issue of whether these people are then scarred for life. They've left school, they've been subjected to the pandemic, they can't get a job. What impact is this going to have in the future? And there is evidence that it will. So scarring does seem to take place. So I don't see great moves on employment, to be honest. I think that the Chancellor is going to be very careful. I mean, obviously, he's got a lot of people in his party who want him to cut income tax, because Conservatives are the tax-cutting party. But whether he would cut income tax, I mean, a 1 penny cut will cost him 10 billion. And also, it's inflationary. So I don't see a lot on employment coming out in this autumn statement.
And I want to bring in things that might have an impact on employment in 1 minute. But there's a question from Colin Crooks, which sort of links our last sort of discussion with this one. This is probably one for Martin. But following on from the point regarding statutory sick pay, are there any other structural initiatives the government could take to support SMEs with wage inflation?
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned three things in conversations with the Chancellor, and we're conscious of the fact that in an election year, their eye will always be on what is electorally attractive. Business taxation is one area that they've said that they'll make movements on. And the one area of business taxation which rankles the most with small businesses in particular are business rates. And vulnerable sectors like, for example, retail, in other words, the high street, are areas where business rates have a disproportionate impact. So we're asking him to maintain currently the 75% discount that he's got on business rates for high street retailers. That would make quite a big difference to both people's perception of how well the economy is doing and their feeling about their towns and whether their towns are thriving. The second area I think he definitely needs to move on is construction. Construction's in the doldrums. There are significantly lower starts. And if he doesn't make a move on how he's going to address the problems of, getting more houses built, I think they could pay a very heavy price at the ballot box. But again, I think the point that Hilary's made before is that there is a sort of dichotomy here when affluent Conservative voters in the southeast of England don't particularly want lots of new development in and around their area. But unless you start to build houses, you're building a very aggressive, anti-conservative, young alliance of people who will see them as very negative when it comes to their future prospects. So I think they're going to have to tackle those two dilemmas somehow if they're going to make real progress next year.
Yeah, the challenges keep on mounting. I suppose a point that I suppose we're focusing on what might be in the autumn statement, but obviously back in spring there were some very big announcements, particularly around childcare. And I suppose the more that's come out, the debates of whether that is actually doable, that, as you were saying, Jane, and Annika Gilbert was asked a question around the promised reforms on childcare. Is there enough money, I suppose, for the government's promise to cover the 3-hour pledge for those 9 months upwards? And is that the only sticking point, or are there other challenges that need to be tackled around childcare?
There are definitely other challenges as well. Certainly there isn't enough money. I think it was the CBI that worked out it was something like 4 billion short in terms of actually satisfying demand. The other issue, of course, is that so many nurseries are small businesses. They've been absolutely hammered. Partly, so many of them went out of business during the pandemic for very obvious reasons. But you have a real issue with the labour force within that area, where you have people being forced out of those kinds of roles and going into nursery workers, being forced out of those roles and going into retail or hospitality or leisure, because although the wages aren't fantastic there, they're certainly better than being a nursery worker. And for us, there's also something about the fact that teachers, primary school teachers, are saying that when they're first getting children coming into primary school, there are a large number of children that can't do things like feed themselves, tie their shoelaces. Some of them are still in nappies. All of that kind of stuff is really scary, which means that we do need money invested in childcare and early years. There's a consortium that we're part of, a coalition which is run by the Women's Budget Group, looking at all of these issues, and it's called the Early Years and Childcare Coalition. And they're trying to find a way of suggesting practical solutions to government. But one of the issues is going to be the lack of wages within the sector to attract employees in order to ensure that that market works.
Yeah. And Martin, do you want to come in on
yeah,
this?
well, it was, I think Jane's said everything I was going to say. I mean, essentially, the problem was the Chancellor had addressed the wrong issue last time. What he addressed was demand, and he should have been addressing supply. There isn't enough supply of childcare. That's where the problem is. And as Jane says, a lot of small businesses that, I mean, I think I was quoted, one childcare provider said she can earn more money walking dogs than she can look after children. It's a ridiculously low rate that the government provides, and the idea that it's somehow subsidised, it's simply cross subsidy that's going on at the moment. So they need to address that problem.
And just to add to what Martin said, we know that in lower income areas of higher deprivation, there's even less availability of childcare, which again means that you're pushing that childcare onto, for example, grandparents, which is then pushing grandparents into poverty. So it's a whole kind of nasty circular business.
Yeah, and I suppose linking to our earlier conversation a little bit, earlier this week, the House of Commons Work and Pensions Select Committee said that their cost of living support needed to be extended beyond the packages already available. I think specifically for those obviously who are low paid or struggling. Is that anything that people would hear call for, or would, you know, that I know that you've mentioned this slightly, Jane, but you know that the cost of living support that we saw last year for the majority of people is now not there, but that drag of the cost of living crisis is continuing. Jane, or any of you?
I went to an event in London last week where one of the London councils, and obviously this is a London specific issue because of the high private rents in London, but they were saying that there were 184 families a week being made homeless. Families, i.e. people with young children, where at least at least one adult within that family was in work. So our focus would very much be on lower income people. And you know, to support what Martin said about small businesses employ the bulk of people within the UK. They need to be supported to grow and expand. And sorry, just one last thing. We as a small charity are also a small business. And we're part of the prompt payment group, but we find that organizations are taking, large organizations, household names, are taking longer than 100 days to pay us for our services that we deliver them. These aren't donations. This is work that we do for people for which we get paid. And again, for small businesses, you know, it's just how on earth do you survive for 100 days without a bill coming in?
Thank you. And I suppose just before we're going to ask everyone for their sort of calls for the autumn statement in a few minutes. And it's actually been a question from Joseph Mount that said, if there is this potentially magical 15 billion amount available for fiscal drag, what would the panelists want to see it be spent on? So I'll let you sort of think about that. But Hilary, just coming to this question, I suppose, around Martin and others have talked about the skills gaps that we're seeing within the labour market, and you know that small businesses and other organisations are struggling to get the right skills in the door, and we've obviously still got very high levels of vacancies, even though they've dropped. What are there areas that the Chancellor and the government should be looking at around skills to give us a better chance, so that in future years when we do events like this, we can talk about a stable labour market?
Well, I think what we haven't mentioned much in this debate so far is the economy is not growing. I mean, the economy is flatlined, and there is some possibility we might go into a recession. And if you look at what's been going on, and I mean, this is not recent, it's not to do with the pandemic, it's historic. Investment in Britain is stagnant. We are not investing. So if we're not investing, we're not generating new jobs. If we're not generating new jobs, we're not having the opportunities to actually skill workers in the new techniques that they need to know. So we really need to get the economy growing, I think, and then some of these other things will follow. The government has looked at these. I mean, one area it's looked at is, it's putting a lot of money into STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and maths. And I think one of the things that it is doing that might help this skills gap is it's diverting some money away from higher education to further education. So colleges that actually, deliver more vocational based training. So that might help to address it. But of course, we've got a big deficit, and we're not going to catch up overnight. So I think the skill shortage will remain. And then the question is, who should be providing it? Is it colleges, universities, or whatever? Or should there be funds available to help firms go for in-house training? I train people for the exact jobs they need them to do. But we certainly do have a skill shortage, and it's been there for a long time.
Thank you, Hilary. And I think I'm going to ask you now, all in roughly 60 seconds, to come up with your sort of big call for the autumn statement next week, what you'd like to see the Chancellor do. And you can use that 15 billion of potential fiscal headroom, or you can just come up with what you think might be realistic. But can I start with Jane, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Our two asks, and maybe one of them is going to happen, Martin hinted at it earlier on, is that for us, it's that increase in the minimum wage that is really important. Income, so people on minimum wage spend more of their money than people on higher incomes do. So it's a positive circular thing for the economy. And then the other thing is looking at an uplift for benefits, and finally the issue around childcare. in order to get parents, particularly mothers, into work in a sustainable way, and also to stimulate supply within the childcare sector. Those for us are the three things that are the most important right now.
Great, thank you. And I think they're all things that the Work Foundation would support as well. So on to Martin.
Yeah, I sense that the 15 billion is going to be used as an electoral bribe. So I wouldn't expect that to be spent on any of the things that we might value. One of the most important things for us, and Jane mentioned it earlier, is late payment. It roughly doubles the amount of money that small businesses have to carry because their working capital has increased just to cover the costs of their customers not paying them on time. If that money was available, they could invest it more productively. It could address some of the issues that Hilary was talking about. It is a real drag on the economy. It's a cultural problem. It's something that government needs to address. And I think I would put that absolutely at the top of the list. They know we are absolutely passionate about this, and I'm hopeful that they will at least do something to put their own house in order as big purchasers of services throughout the country.
Thank you very much, Martin. And finally, Hilary.
Well, I totally agree with what the other two contributors have said. So they've taken those away from me. So I think the one thing I would like to see, because I do worry about how our economy seems to be stagnating, I would like tax breaks for investment, for company investment, to try and prompt more investment in the economy, because it's the only way we're going to grow. And then secondly, I'm going to throw in a curved ball. It sort of relates to Jane, but we've not mentioned this throughout, and it won't happen. I would like them to address the problem of social care, because we've got an aging population. You know, there is not the provision. Again, Jane will know, a lot of these people that work in care homes, they are very low paid. A lot of them are mothers who can work overnight shifts because it fits in with their partner's work practices. And every government says they're going to address it, and nobody ever does. So I would like at some stage for it to be looked at.
That's a really good call. And social care, and we've talked about childcare, they face some similar, if different problems. Thank you so much for those comments, and thank you so much for all the questions that have been coming in today. I've tried to get through as many as possible. So I think that brings us to a close in terms of the conversation this morning. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all our panelists for their contributions, and to all of you for attending, and to the Work Foundation team who lead on producing our analysis and putting together sessions like this. At the Work Foundation, we've got a busy programme of research and events across the remainder of 2023 and into 2024. Earlier this week, we published new research together with the Chartered Management Institute looking at the role of managers in insecure work settings, and we'll soon be publishing new analysis setting out how insecure work is playing out across English regions, and a policy paper looking at how the next government could reform zero-hour contracts. You can see our events on our website, but our next event is next Tuesday at 2 p.m, which is called Delivering Levelling Up, How Secure Work Can Reduce Regional Inequality. So thank you again for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and goodbye.